Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank sincerely to organizer to invite me here. I am not a traditional visitor to Israel. It is my first time. But as you see, I am on a very good way to become a traditional one. So I also like to thank for the questions raised by the organizer, expecting to be responded by me today with this short lecture. The main question actually was rather the Bologna process is an initiative set as a response in order to face an external threat from supposedly US or Asian tigers and so on, or was it an initiative to demonstrate the European normative power through an educational mean? If this is a typical question, either or. From the very beginning, I would like to say that I would shift from either or to and something else. So basically, I think that it is quite difficult to squeeze these 10, 15 years of policy development and higher education reforms into simple formulas. It is all more complex and complicated. For this reason, let me first present briefly what will be the main points. I'm going to speak about them. We can't avoid an introduction on the historical context. It is now about 15 years, as you know, from the beginning. Then I would address the relationship between the process, between the Bologna process and the emerging and finally set up European higher education area, EHIA, as an abbreviation, one of many today. Further, to go more deeply to the so-called global strategy, once upon a time called the external dimension of the Bologna process, and finally to say a few words about the implementation of this strategy and its impact in international cooperation in higher education of today. Okay, let's start with this historical context. This will, I apologize here, this will not be more than a very brief reminder, absolutely not an extended analysis, we don't have time of that. And I decided to just to put 4 elements to remind us about this historical context of the 90s, which Dr. Rüdgers already spoke about, so it is much easier to me now. I would say there were 4 main horizons, 4 main dimensions, which influenced the birth of that quite strong policy movement, I could say. First, it is the so-called Europeanization of higher education, which has started, of course, much earlier than with Sorbonne and Bologna. We should start at least with the Erasmus program in the mid-80s, if not before. There is an excellent book on the history, on the 50 years of history, actually, of European higher education, written by a British scholar, Anne Corbett, if you know. This is worth to read if you would like to enter into details. Indeed, in the early 90s, the speed of this Europeanization, which was quite low in the 80s or 70s, was increased. And in particular, it was increased with the Maastricht Treaty of the European Union, which, for the first time in the modern European history of the EU, put in the front issues of education and higher education. So this is one important pillar, if I may use this famous word from conferences of today. The next one, it is of course the fear, the global competition, also in higher education. the complaint European universities are lagging behind was quite often heard at that time. But there was also something else, not only these two, European dimension and the fear from overseas. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall, symbolically saying. And all these changes after that. For higher education, I firmly believe it was extremely important that hundreds of universities east of the Berlin Wall, so to say, suddenly got an opportunity to cooperate very directly, very closely, and with money support from Brussels. Tempus program was launched with counterparts in the Western Europe. I am, let me say, an example as an academic of that. So I know what it is, just as it is today a time for anecdotes, as I understood from Dr. Riedgers. Let me tell one anecdote from myself. I was at the university in that turbulent period, 89, 90, 91. And at that time, Brussels decided to open door to Yugoslavia of that time. My country was part of that state, to Tempus. And we got a huge money. And the country disappeared. And Slovenia, my country, was the only which could use that money. And we got 10 times more money. Yeah, and I think that we did a good job in 1902, 1903, 1904, just starting in this direction. So I'm happy about these events. I think that this was really an important progressive step forward. And last but not least, in this time, not only by political means, also sometimes by bilateral agreements between universities or on purely individual basis, mobility, both mobility of students and mobility of staff, suddenly increased a lot. Not necessarily, I repeat, not necessarily with the European Commission or national budget funds. Quite often, this was on individual basis. But now, there were no visas. It was easy to travel. And these are altogether elements which need one to bear in mind when we are discussing why this process, why it came. Secondly, of course, that among analysts, policy decision makers, and so on, it was clear what was already told today. I can be just brief here, that diversities within Europe of the 90s simply came to extreme edges. There were definitely too much divergences. Here I put some quotations from a background study for the Bologna 99 conference. It was presented a day before the declaration was signed. And here we can read again about extreme diversity to such a degree that it may well be called confusion or even chaos, and so on and so on. So these are very critical words. Told in front of 27 European ministers and maybe some 200 European rectors at this conference. So this was not joking. This was something what we felt very true and very problematic at this period of the time. On the other hand, it was also stressed. This is on the side of the on the European fear about US and maybe some other world regions. It was stressed that there is no ready-to-use external model, so we cannot copy-paste the American model. We need something European to accommodate this chaos, these real problems in Europe. And last but not least, it was stressed that what Europe needs, it is a move towards shorter studies. And this was a true stone in a shoe, I would say, for a majority of European professors of that time and maybe even for today. So this is these are issues which raised at that time and also later a number of concerns. And today we can read and we can listen to a number of criticisms of Bologna. I'm sure that you know about it. There are not only pro-Bologna guys, there are also cons groups and a lot of criticism. When we are addressing the issue of concerns, the issue of risks in higher education policy, I would like to draw your attention back to 1999. It was only half a year after the Sorbonne Declaration was signed, and an important scholar within that group of architects, Guy wrote an article where he addressed 5 concerns for post-Bologna. So we don't need to read modern criticism on the Bologna, whatever kind it is. We can step back to that time. People who were working in this area were quite aware of possible risks. Which risks did he mention? The first one, I think, is most important from today's point of view. The risk of non-concerted reforms. The risk of reforms implemented in various ways in different countries or in different regions within Europe. This is maybe the main problem of today. Next, he says about the risk to focus on very small differences rather than looking at the big common issues. Again, I think this is a problem 15 years later, but not of the same intensity as the previous one. It depends mainly on institution, sometimes on the country. Sometimes this is a harder issue, sometimes it is not such a hard issue, but this should be kept in mind still. The third, the risk that the challenge from abroad remains underestimated. Here I think he made a mistake. I don't believe that this challenge was underestimated. Mainly not. Both policy makers as well as academics in Europe have become very well aware on that issue. The next one, the risk of, if not all countries in Europe be included in the process. Again, this risk, it looked like a risk in '99, but not from today's point of view. 47 countries, you heard. Even Kazakhstan, which somehow I didn't understand well why this is European country. Okay, they are member. Nevertheless, we need to openly say here that there are 2 countries, 2 European countries, which are not members of the EHEA. On one hand, it is Belarus, and we know for what reasons. And on the other hand, we forgot too often, this is Kosovo, another political problem. So it means that Europe did not solve all issues yet, at least not in this regard. Finally, the last risk here is that the most important risk, he says, is that higher education institutions themselves underestimate the level of change. And again, I would say that it depends. I believe that most of European institutions are really well aware on this issue, but almost in every country you can find one which perhaps underestimate the importance of internationalization in higher education of today. Okay, if we move from these risks and from these concerns for post-Bologna to the birth, which was not 9 months after that famous meeting Jürgen Rüdgers told us about, but 12. It's strange, yeah. But nevertheless, okay, baby was healthy from the very beginning. If we observe this main part of the Bologna Declaration, then it is quite difficult to get any serious and open and direct point on the so-called internationalization, or in this globalization. It seems like the Bologna Declaration is an intra-European issue, mainly. So the only point where the declaration mentions openly other world regions, other countries outside Europe and so on, this is a very strange sentence. We must in particular look at the objective of increasing the international competitiveness of the European systems of higher education. I couldn't agree more with what Dr. Rüdgers told us just a couple of minutes ago about values. This is not a value I would be particularly proud of it. Nevertheless, I understand that this is an issue. But if you proceed with the 6 action lines, as we usually call, these are very technical and these are very European, intra-European. So this issue, an issue how to cooperate in global framework, it was actually not raised in Bologna. We should not forget that. Recently, I did an analysis of, let's say, history of political ideas within the Bologna process. And one of the points on this figure, number 14, is the global dimension. So what this figure presents. On top, here on top, there are declarations and communiques, all most important communiques, starting with the Sorbonne Declaration 1908 and ending with the Bergen, but Leuven communique in 2009. And on the vertical axis, you can find main policy ideas starting, I don't know if the last rows can see on the screen, but we start with such broad values like respecting cultural diversities, democratic values, higher education as a public good, and so on. And we are ending with the, for example, European dimension, global dimension, and so on and so forth. So global dimension is the only point, the only policy idea, and you can see that it appeared rather late. Red means that such an idea does not appear at all. Yellow means yes, but within lines. You need to read carefully. And green, it means it appears in the text in the front. So here you can see that the global dimension actually really appeared only in 2003. I will tell a few words more on that later. This is what you see now on the screen. These are 2 quotations from the final declaration of the Bologna process. Okay, it is not the final, but it is the final before announcing that the European higher education area is now set up. This is Vienna-Budapest Declaration of 2010. What do we see here? On one hand, we read again that the vision from 1999 to set up an internationally competitive and attractive EHEA is now finally realized. So on one hand, Europeans cheer themselves, we did it. On the other hand, in the second quotation, we can read some lines which are very critical or actually self-critical. We read that all Bologna aims and reforms have not been properly implemented and explained, and so on and so forth. Not to forget, during the second part of this conference, which took place in Vienna, students' demonstrations against Bologna took place outside on streets. So this is why these sentences entered the final declaration. But it is also true that in 2010, we noticed that not all issues have been implemented in that way. In particular, the issue of values. So this important issue, which was put in front in 1980, 1999, maybe 2001, later simply remained on the margins and more technical issues entered in the field together with competition. So Bologna history is quite a long one, and in a certain way, it is diverse in itself. For that reason, we did a survey last year within a within a research project on internationalization of higher education and its impacts in Europe. And we did this survey by checking impact of the Bologna process on various levels. Here on this figure, you can see results from one of the so-called academic tribes and territories. People working in the teacher education area were asked, the Bologna process has contributed importantly to the quality of my institution. Now say yes or no, or I don't know. Responses I don't know were removed from calculation because we focus here to pro and cons, how it looks like. And you can see here quite interesting results. There are countries, on average, first of all, I must tell, on average, the result is positive. But just for 0.30, something like that. So if you put all together. If you focus to these two opposite groups, then you can see that on one hand that we have countries around 0.1, 0.2 is maximum. Yeah, 0.1 is average positive theoretically, but we can find mainly countries between plus 0.75 and plus 1.00. Which countries are these? These are countries which more or less we know are doing rather well in higher education for many years, even before the Bologna process started. On the other hand, we have also the group of red countries, if I may call them green and red in this case. And here, the situation looks a little bit more severe. These are, on one hand, the so-called transitional countries. You can't find many of them on the previous column, but here we have also very strong countries, like, for example, France or Germany. This is not a majority group, because I put here Austria. I hope that you recognize these abbreviations from your email letters you sent. Yeah? Austria is the bottom in this group, and Austria is already positive. But its positive result is 0.07. That's an interesting picture, isn't it? But what we can learn from this picture, it is that we have pros and cons, that there is no simple division between these countries. So we have Germany, which is in red colors here. But we also have, these are not only transitional countries, this is what I would like to say. On the other hand, it is not only Swiss or Denmark or Netherlands, but you can find Albania and Kosovo at the same place. So this is an issue which require more patience and more detailed analysis before simply saying that there are countries with severe troubles and there are countries and so on and so forth. But this is in one tribe, teacher education. What about higher education in general? Unfortunately, there is no concise data on this. I hope that we will get another project and money to do it. But last year we repeated this question with a sample of countries. This is the region of Western Balkans. 8 countries, 17 universities. And why I put this on the screen? Because we can recognize 4 different kinds of responses within these 8 countries. Unbelievable. 1 region, 8 countries only, but 4 distinctive types of response to the question, did Bologna contribute to quality? On one hand, you can see countries which are more green than red. Which countries are this? Again, this is Albania and Kosovo in our case, in case of this region. Then we have countries which are, so to say, totally red. And these are in particular Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia. And I'm sure that our next speaker can comment on these findings. And then we have very strange kind of country, that these are 2 universities per country. In Macedonia, One university responded in red answers, the other in green. So even here, we do not have the same approach to this. Anyhow, we can learn from this picture that national policies in higher education, as well as institutional policies in higher education, are extremely important with regard to this question. Again, we would need more time and more analysis to go in depth. Now, let me go to this final part and tell a few words on the so-called external dimension of the Bologna process, or better to say, the global strategy. Here on this picture, you have first two quotations from early documents, from the Sorbonne and from Bologna Declaration once again. I can be very brief here because we already talked on that. This was not ignored. This issue of cooperation between European higher education area and other countries was not ignored. However, it was squeezed it was pressed to the corner. It was a marginal issue. But in 2007, the London Conference of Education Ministers adopted the European higher education in a global setting strategy. That means a special policy paper aimed to respond on this issue. And let me tell a few words about how the idea was raised. The idea that the Bologna process needs more clear answers on this particular issue, how to organize relationship between European area and any other country of the world, was addressed at the Berlin Conference 2003 for the first time. And as it usually is, the ministers agreed to form a committee. And this was not just forming a committee. This committee responded in 2005 at the Bergen Conference with first findings. And another committee was formed to draft a strategy. And in 2007 in London, this strategy was already approved by the ministers. This is the front page. If you can find it on internet. And let's just briefly comment on main ideas behind. In the introductory part, the strategy stresses that there should be a joint strategy in this area, in this policy area. We forgot a little bit about it. Countries and institutions in particular, in the last stage of the Bologna process, do not have any kind of common policy regarding the issue of international cooperation with other countries and other institutions. So this was addressed as a problem. And on the other hand, it was also noted that now, it means 2007, the Bologna process has become an appeal for other countries or other world regions. It was true. At that time, the Bologna follow-up group already received first letters from abroad, from ministries mainly, or certain international organization, to join the Bologna conferences in Europe. And on the other hand, the strategy consists of two main parts. Part one, these are guiding principles. I'm very happy, after what we heard from Dr. Riedgers today, to say that many of these early ideas, early Bologna ideas from Sorbonne and Bologna conferences, were put into the front. There are 3 chapters. Chapter number 1 is entitled European Heritage and Values. And the main point here is that we need to put in the front issues like, for example, institutional autonomy and academic freedom, belief in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, cultural and religious dialogue, and tolerance. So when European higher education area is opening its door and windows, inviting friends worldwide, then this should be fundamental values on which we can build, let me say, a trustful and a sound cooperation in the area. The second point, it is actually a result of a very specific operation of the Bologna process in Europe. It is the stakeholder participation. The Bologna process from the very beginning, it is true, within the Bologna follow-up group, representatives of ministers vote if it is needed to vote, but mainly decisions are made on anonymous basis. However, there are also other members of the BFUG, as we call this group, like, for example, European Association of Universities, European Association of Students, trade unions in higher education, and so on. And all these people have contributed, in particular after 2003, 2005, importantly. So the idea is that higher education is too important to be left only to ministers or only to rectors. So that partners should discuss these issues together before implementing it. And finally, the geographical scope. There were plenty of debates and disputes on this issue, and finally we agreed that there should be no limitation. So geographically observing, all countries of the world are appreciated within this cooperation if they fit to the number 1 and number 2, values and partnership communication. On the second part of the strategy is a little bit more practical. It lists 5 core policy areas. So what, in practical terms, should countries and institutions do in this field? It is to improve information on the European higher education area, to promote it, and to enhance its worldwide attractiveness, to strengthen cooperation based on partnership for mutual benefit, to intensify policy dialogue. Just by the way, every 2 years, when are these ministers' conferences, and policy forum is organized since, I think, since Leuven, 2009, and it is open to everybody from world. And last but not least, to further recognition of qualifications. This is in particularly a tricky issue still, 20 years after this, well, almost after this recognition convention was signed. Now, for the end, just asking, and what about this implementation? The strategy was adopted 6 years ago, 2007. And today, what is the impact of this paper? Unfortunately, so far, no complex, comprehensive survey was done on this issue. At my center, we did a small survey, and last year an article was published on this, and I will refer to these findings. Here you have main sources of information. These are reports and surveys from other sources. None of them strictly focused to the issue we deal here. We still need in Europe to do something in this area. But among many documents here, we can find, for example, an example from the document from a report of the BFUG from 2009, which says, it is clear that the Bologna process has enhanced the cooperation between countries, inside and outside Europe. However, most countries seem to promote their own higher education systems internationally, and very few promote the European higher education area. So in this regard, nothing has changed, and this stone is still in the European shoes. This is from the national point of view. This was made by interviews of people from ministries. This now is quotation from institutional point of view. Rectors were interviewed. And the result, unfortunately, is more or less the same. There is little joint European cooperation outside Europe, with each European country pursuing its own internationalization strategy. So universities are doing European projects abroad, like, for example, through Tempus, but Tempus is a small part of that work. And that's another problem. Yeah. Finally, this is part of the study we did last year, I told you. What about geographical priorities at the national level? So it is interesting that all the world is not on the same level, that certain world regions, green means a lot of interest, but this interest is quite diverse within Europe. Nevertheless, we received about 16 votes in favor of all are of equal priority, or only European Union Europe, or only non-European Europe, or Middle East, or Asia. So these are groups. While Africa, Latin America, and Australia are just in the bottom, and the US is somewhere in the middle. This is picture from the institutional point of view, which is more or less the same, does not change much, but this is, here you can see changes in 10 years perspective, and this is on the level of institution I already talked about. I will finish, last but not least, with a question at which I think that here today you can help us a lot with our problems. Namely, this is a question which was raised in Europe, but hasn't been continuously raised. Namely, how do they see us? So in this global strategy approach, it is too much observation from my point of view and not in the more, let me say, in more global framework. I would say this is the main point which Europe needs to discuss in this decade, and this is at the same time a point which we discuss together, finally. Thank you very much.